The last thing I want to talk about today, Mr. President, is some bad news that we received this week. And this is about our federal government and the lack of information out there from federal agencies as to how they're spending our hard-earned tax dollars. As many people know, our federal government has grown a lot in the last half century or so. In 1961, when President Kennedy entered office with 7 cabinet positions and 451 career management positions, to today, when President Trump took office, we've gone about 7 times higher in terms of the number of people. We've gone from the number of cabinet posts being doubled from 7 to 15. The increased size of our federal government is intended, of course, to provide a better structure to carry out important duties the government has and help more Americans. But one result we have to be cautious of is the increase in federal spending that comes with it. As the size of our government grows, transparency in how taxpayer money is spent becomes increasingly important. Most of the increase in the funding you've seen over the last 20 years, of course, is in programs that Congress does not appropriate every year. This includes important entitlement programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And we need to address this unsustainable growth in the so-called non-discretionary spending. We need to save these entitlement programs for the current and future generations of Americans who rely on them. But we also need to ensure we rein in the waste, fraud, and abuse in our departments and agencies. This so-called discretionary spending that Congress spends every year, the departments and programs, that's where this legislation is so important to be able to require transparency and accountability with how federal agencies spend their taxpayer dollars. While the White House and Congress track spending through the budget and appropriations process, each federal agency tracks its own spending internally. They've got their own metrics, and they've got their own measurement systems. As you can imagine, it's made it hard to truly know where all the funds are going to various departments and agencies, because each has their own measurement. We recognized the need to address this in 2006 when I was Director of the Office of Management and Budget. The Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act became law. I personally endorsed that legislation when I was at OMB because I knew we needed it badly. Then Senator Tom Coburn, who some of you will remember, was the key sponsor of that. And we went about putting all grants and contracts online. That was a good thing. The goal of the law was to standardize the way the federal departments and agencies report their spending, to have a more comprehensive and transparent account of where taxpayer dollars were going. It also created a public website managed by the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, called usaspending.gov, where taxpayers and policymakers could go to get accurate, accessible information about what these funds are used for. Taxpayers should be able to see where their money goes. And Congress, which is given the power of the purse in our federal government, needs to know what the funds it allocates are being used for to make informed decisions about spending. In 2010, the GAO, Government Accountability Office, looked into how this program was working. And what they found was that the usefulness of usaspending.gov, this website, was impaired by the lack of guidance to agencies on how to report their spending. So in 2014, a colleague of mine, Mark Warner, and I, Senator Warner from Virginia, authored what's called the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or the DATA Act. And we followed what the GAO had said. We wrote this legislation to try to fix the law. The goal of the DATA Act was to create a more consistent spending system across government to improve the efficiency of usaspending.gov and to make tracking federal spending more transparent and accessible. That would ultimately provide the American public and policymakers, we thought, with accurate, consistent, and reliable data on government-wide spending to eliminate unnecessary spending. Being able to follow federal dollars from appropriations to the resulting grant or contract that actually occurs is incredibly helpful in that effort. The DATA Act required federal agencies to report spending in real time, down to the location by congressional district, by 2017. Now it's time to take stock of how that program is working and to assess the transparency in our federal spending. The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations here in the Senate, which I chair, has taken this task on. And along with Ranking Member Senator Tom Carper, we've looked into the implementation of the DATA Act and how accurately departments and agencies report spending data. What our bipartisan report found was troubling. We reviewed Inspectors General, or IG, reports of 25 federal agencies, making up more than 80% of all federal spending from the second quarter of 2017. At least 55% of the spending data, equal to roughly $240 billion those agencies submitted to usaspending.gov, was found to be incomplete, inaccurate, or both. Notably, the IG's report on the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy determined that 100% of those departments' spending data was not accurate. According to the Inspector General, some agencies, such as the Department of Education and the Agency for National Development, did well. They reported accurate data. Unbelievably, about 96% of the spending data that the Treasury Department submitted for its own department was not accurate. So the Treasury Department, which the Data Act says is supposed to monitor other departments' spending data for accuracy, overwhelmingly submitted inaccurate data itself. And we found just last month, OMB and the Department of Treasury have updated the agency guidance that appears to weaken some of these data standards, which could lead to even less accurate and not standardized data submissions in the future. So we should be doing more to ensure this law is properly implemented, to ensure accountability and accuracy in our finances. We also found deficiencies with usafunding.gov website itself. The Data Act requires the website to be user-friendly and accurate. Our investigators found it to sometimes be neither. It's important to remember that the Data Act is still in its early stages. It was fully implemented just a little over 1 year ago. So it's not yet what we hoped it would be when it became law in 2014, but it's not too late to improve it. We know what has to be done. Our PSI, Permanent Subcommittee Investigations report, includes recommendations to do just that. First, that OMB and the Treasury Department should update the standards and guidelines for agencies to follow when making Data Act submissions to improve accuracy and accountability of spending. It's really up to them to do it. Second, OMB and Treasury should establish clear definitions for agencies and IGs to follow when conducting reviews of Data Act compliance to avoid any existing confusion and disparity, which we found is out there today. Finally, the Treasury Department should improve the overall quality of usaspending.gov. These are all reasonable steps, and they're going to help increase accountability within the federal government and provide greater transparency for taxpayers. As I mentioned, taxpayers deserve to be able to access accurate information on where their money's going, and lawmakers need to know how departments and agencies are actually spending their resources to be able to conduct proper oversight, plan future budgets, and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in our federal spending. On the floor today, we were discussing appropriations bills. We will pass another 4 appropriations bills this week, I hope. That's good. But part of this process is we got to be sure we're doing the oversight so that as we're passing spending bills, all 12 of them, which should be passed by this Congress, we know where the money's going so we can identify ways to improve the spending. I recognize a lot of hard work has gone into usaspending.gov to date, and I am grateful for all the support and investment that many outside groups, like the Data Coalition and the Project on Government Oversight, have put into making this project successful. I also appreciate those in the federal government who have taken this seriously and have worked hard on this. Although the executive branch has only implemented the law selectively so far, it has already made our government more transparent. If we continue to do the necessary follow-up to this important law that passed 4 years ago, I'm optimistic it will spur action to make our government spending more accountable, more accurate, and more accessible. That's the goal. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time.